जिंदाबाद। आप सभी साथियों को जिंदाबाद और धन्यवाद। आपने इस डब्ल्यूपीसी द्वारा आयोजित इस बजट के संदर्भ में इस कार्यक्रम को जो हमने ऑर्गेनाइज किया, आप लोग सब यहाँ पे आए, सब आपने पार्टिसिपेट किया, इसके लिए बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। और काफी अच्छा, काफी जगहों से लोग ज्वाइन किए हैं पूरे हिंदुस्तान से। उसके लिए सभी साथियों को बहुत बहुत धन्यवाद। आज का जो कार्यक्रम है वो हम लोगों ने बहुत सोचा इस बारे में कि बजट में मजदूरों के लिए तो कुछ है नहीं, तो उसके लिए हम फिर भी इस पे क्या बात करें, क्या काम करें। लेकिन वर्किंग पीपल्स चार्टर की अपनी एक समझ जो पिछले हमने 5-6 सालों में बनाई कि सोशल सिक्योरिटी क्या है, उसमें हमारे क्या सवाल हैं, और स्पेशली बजट के सवाल को लेकर सर भी आज कार्यक्रम में है। और बहुत सारे लोग इस कार्यक्रम में जो शामिल हैं उन बहुत साल हम लोगों को समझाने में, हमको हमारी एक पर्सपेक्टिव को बिल्ड करने में बहुत मदद की कि कैसे हम अपने डिमांड्स को फ्रेम करें, कैसे उसको पॉलिटाइज करें। और थोड़ी बहुत हमारी आज समझ बनी है कि हम क्या मांग रहे हैं। बजट 2022 में कुछ नहीं है, फिर भी हमें लगा कि इसके बारे में बात करनी चाहिए। और इसके जो राजनीतिक और आर्थिक सवाल है, जो पॉलिटिकल सवाल है, जो जो बजट में मजदूरों के लिए नहीं थे, तो 50 करोड़ मजदूरों के लिए इस बजट में करके आज का ये सत्र हम लोगों ने आयोजित किया है। वी हैव ऑर्गेनाइज्ड this panel because we thought initially that there's nothing in the budget, then why we should organize anything. But a lot of our colleagues said that this is very important to talk about it, that the budget 2022 has completely failed to address all the long-standing question and recent, the urgent question. And we thought that let's think about that. What is the agenda of 50 crore workers in this budget? So without saying much further, I hand over the floor to our comrade Anuradha Talwar. She is the leader of Paschim Banga Khet Mazdoor Samiti. We all know her. She doesn't need introduction. And she has been organizing rural workers, particularly in the fishery sector, agriculture sectors, tea garden workers. And she's working a lot on the different issues of the working class in India and beyond too. So without any further delay, Didi, the floor is yours. Didi, please start the program. Didi.
Thank you very much, Chandan. सभी को नमस्कार। मैं कोशिश करूंगी हिंदी और अंग्रेजी मिक्स करके बोलने की, जैसे कि कुछ लोगों ने रिक्वेस्ट किया है। तो आज का जो सेशन है, जैसे चंदन ने कहा, ये बहुत ही इम्पोर्टेंट है, क्योंकि बजट निकला है और बजट में मजदूरों के लिए क्या है क्या नहीं है देखने की जरूरत है। आप तो सभी, मतलब ये पुरानी चीजें दोहराने की जरूरत नहीं है, लेकिन इनफॉर्मल सेक्टर जो था वो तो शुरू से ही बहुत ही बुरी हालत में रहा है, और राइट्स की तरफ से बहुत ही कम अधिकार मिलते हैं इनफॉर्मल सेक्टर के लोगों को। लेकिन उसके अलावा जो रिसेंटली कोविड के 2 साल गए हैं, उसमें बहुत ही ज्यादा हमने देखा है कि लोगों की हालत और भी ज्यादा बुरी हुई है। माने एक कंटिन्यूअस प्रोसेस चल रहा है इन इंडिया, नॉट जस्ट इन इंडिया बट ऑल ओवर द वर्ल्ड। वो है कैजुअलाइजेशन का प्रोसेस, व्हिच मींस दैट वर्कर्स आर बेसिकली बीइंग लेफ्ट आउट ऑफ लॉज। और अलग अलग जो कानून है, अलग अलग जो अधिकार हैं, they are being removed from sort of secure and safe places or permanent places of work, secure places of work, and going more and more into precarious kind of employment. और ये ट्रेंड कोविड ने बहुत ज्यादा बढ़ाया है। और अनफॉर्चुनेटली उसी टाइम में जैसे ये भी सब जगह साफ दिखाई दे रहा है, डिस्पैरिटीज बहुत बड़ी हैं। और डिस्पैरिटीज बढ़ने की वजह से मतलब इट्स वेरी ऑब्वियस दैट द क्रिएशन ऑफ वेल्थ इज टेकिंग प्लेस in a huge manner in whatever way it is happening, but on the other hand the share of the workers in this wealth is getting reduced further and further, and their entitlements and their rights are also getting reduced further and further. और हमारे बजट में कभी भी वर्कर शब्द वैसे इस्तेमाल ही नहीं होता है। So you actually, when you look at schemes, whether it's the NREGA or the scheme for the Food Security Act, or all these laws that are there, these are looked more as poverty alleviation programs rather than as workers' rights. तो जो नए कानून भी आए हैं वर्कर्स के लिए, जो मतलब कम से कम गरीब तबके को हेल्प करते हैं, वो मैटरनिटी बेनिफिट के लिए जो योजनाएं हों, या मतलब इवन खाद्य सुरक्षा कानून में जो आया है, या नरेगा के तरह जो कानून आए हैं, उसमें लेकिन बजट जिस तरह से देखता है, या सरकार भी जिस तरह से लोगों को देखती है, वो श्रमिक के हिसाब से या मजदूर के हिसाब से और उनके अधिकार के रूप से नहीं देखती है। इनको पॉवर्टी एलिविएशन के प्रोग्राम से की तरफ से ज्यादा देखा जाता है। और विशेष करके हम लोग जो नरेगा का काम करते हैं, वो देखते हैं कि इट इज दे नॉट इवन ट्रीटेड एज वर्कर्स। तो इसी संदर्भ में आज जो हम चर्चा कर रहे हैं बजट के बारे में, वो बहुत इंपॉर्टेंट है कि एक्चुअली फ्रॉम द वर्कर्स पर्सपेक्टिव क्या हो रहा है, स्पेशली फ्रॉम द वर्कर्स इन द इनफॉर्मल सेक्टर, उनके लिए क्या हो रहा है। जनरली हमने सुना है कि बजट में कट्स हुए हैं, ये सब हुए हैं, बट हाउ डज इट इम्पैक्ट इनफॉर्मल सेक्टर वर्कर्स and what is it that we can look forward to? That is what our discussion today is, or look forward to, rather what we can dread for the future is what we are going to be discussing today. So I would first request, सबसे पहले हमारे स्पीकर जो हैं वो अमित बसोले हैं। अमित बसोले के साथ हम लोगों की काफी दिनों की परिचिति है, and he is one of these exceptional बोल सकते हैं economists who really thinks from the point of view of the poorest section of workers, and that is why he's very welcome in this meeting. He is an associate professor of economics at the School of Liberal Studies in Azim Premji University, and where he teaches development economics and political economy. And he has a very, very sharp perspective on workers, and on especially informal sector workers, and what is needed to be done for them. And they have a lot of work has been done about the state of by them about of the state of Indian workers, and what can be done for them in the future. So I would invite Amit Basole to please take the floor and to please start with his speech. Thank you. Amit, are you there? Can you please take over?
Just 2 minutes. I think he's joining again.
Acha.
Yeah.
ठीक है. So we'll wait for him to join us.
Yeah, he has joined.
Amit, will you start, please?
Yeah, so sorry. I got disconnected right when so,
right when you were supposed to start.
No, so yeah, thank you. Thank you for inviting me. And originally, Chandan's idea, I think, was to listen to all the people who will talk about what needs to be done, and then I was supposed to give a sense of the fiscal considerations that come in. जो राजकोषीय घाटे की बात होती है लगातार, और ये सब जो बातें होती हैं उसका क्या मतलब है, और पैसा कहाँ से आएगा, ये जो सवाल हमेशा होता है. I was supposed to end with that, but unfortunately I have a university meeting at 5 which I can't get out of, so I requested Chandan to speak before. So I'll make some brief comments on this, but I'm definitely more curious about the other people's specific suggestions. I will just lay out for the people who are here and listening what kind of considerations typically economists and policymakers have in mind when they make these decisions. तो जब बजट की हम लोग बात करते हैं तो जाहिर है कि एक साल से दूसरे साल जब बजट समझो 1000 रुपए से बढ़ा है तो हर चीज उसमें बढ़ती नहीं है, कुछ चीजें बढ़ती हैं, कुछ चीजें घटती हैं, और उससे ये पता चलता है कि गवर्नमेंट की प्रायोरिटीज क्या है, क्या चीज बढ़ी है, क्या चीज घटी है. तो इसमें जो डिसीजंस जाते हैं उसमें काफी बार यू हैव टू मेक स्ट्रॉन्ग चॉइसेस. ये होते हैं कि यहाँ बढ़ाएं कि वहां बढ़ाएं, because the overall pressure is always to keep the fiscal deficit on some kind of an announced path. तो ये समझने की जरूरत है कि why is that the case, right? तो ये हम लोग सब जानते हैं कि मोटे तौर पे बजट ये बताता है कि सरकार को कितना पैसा मिलने की अपेक्षा है टैक्स रेवेन्यू में, और वो कितना किस चीज पे खर्च करने की अपेक्षा कर रही है. What is the expected expenditure, what are the expected revenues, and the difference between the two, right, will have to be financed by borrowing. तो ये जो डिफरेंस है वो फिस्कल डेफिसिट कहलाता है, राजकोषीय घाटा कहलाता है. नाउ दैट डिफरेंस डिपेंड्स ऑन द मिसमैच ऑफ द रेवेन्यूज एंड द एक्सपेंडिचर. तो जाहिर है जब महामारी का समय आया तो सरकार के खर्चे बढ़े एंड रेवेन्यूज डिक्लाइंड, तो दोनों चीजें हुई, इसलिए वजह से फिस्कल डेफिसिट बहुत बढ़ गया. तो पिछले साल का फिस्कल डेफिसिट 9% तक चला गया था. जो लोग ये देखते हैं वो समझते होंगे कि सरकार की ये मंशा रहती है कि उसको 3-4% में लाया जाए. अब हम लोग ये पूछ सकते हैं कि 3% क्यों, 4% क्यों. ये सारे आर्बिट्ररी टारगेट्स होते हैं, इसमें कोई बहुत थ्योरेटिकल जस्टिफिकेशन नहीं होता है. लेकिन एक बात होती है कि अगर सरकार रेवेन्यू से बहुत ज्यादा एक्सपेंडिचर करे, इफ द मिसमैच इज अ लॉट, इफ योर रेवेन्यूज आर वेरी लिटिल and your expenditure is a lot, that mismatch which is financed by borrowings has some repercussions on the economy. तो वो समझने की जरूरत है, वो मैं बस 2 मिनट लेकर समझाऊंगा. so that then we can evaluate whether they are realistic or not. So the first thing to note is that whenever the government spends money, it is creating demand. वो मांग बढ़ा रही है अर्थव्यवस्था में, क्योंकि लोगों पे पैसा, लोगों के मजदूरी पे पैसा खर्च हो रहा है अगर मनरेगा जैसा कार्यक्रम है, या कोई और खर्चा कर रही है सरकार, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर का प्रोजेक्ट है, सोशल सिक्योरिटी पेमेंट्स दे रही है, तो वो लोगों के जेब में पैसे डाल रही है या कुछ माल खरीद रही है. ऑल ऑफ दिस क्रिएट्स अ डिमांड इन द इकोनॉमी. नाउ इफ दैट डिमांड इज नॉट मेट विद एन एडिक्वेट सप्लाई, अगर आपूर्ति नहीं है तो वो इन्फ्लेशन पैदा करता है. और डर हमेशा सरकार को यही रहता है कि हम लोग पैसा तो खर्च कर सकते हैं, बोरोइंग से भी खर्च कर सकते हैं, but if that demand is not met with an adequate supply, then we will be faced with a situation of inflation, which is never popular. So क्या ये realistic fear है, ये सवाल बनता है. ये एक सवाल है. और दूसरा ये है कि आपके रेवेन्यूज इतने कम क्यों हैं कि आपको आपके खर्च पूरे नहीं करते आ रहे हैं. तो ये दोनों सवाल हैं. तो एक एक करके मैं संक्षिप्त में ये दोनों कहता हूँ. सरकार जब पैसा खर्च करती है, चाहे वो सोशल सिक्योरिटी पे हो, से हेल्थ पे हो, एजुकेशन पे हो, मनरेगा पे हो, पीडीएस पे हो, इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पे हो, तो उसमें से कुछ फ्यूचर कैपेसिटी बनती है इकोनॉमी की प्रोडक्शन बढ़ाने की. जैसे अगर आप हेल्थ पे स्पेंड कर रहे हैं तो लोगों की सेहत इंप्रूव हो रही है, या शिक्षा पे कर रहे हैं तो आपके फ्यूचर जनरेशन के वर्कर्स जो हैं वो ज़्यादा शिक्षित होकर निकल रहे हैं. इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर पे कर रहे हैं तो बिजली की आपूर्ति बढ़ गई, सड़कों की हालत बेहतर हो गई, इससे फिर कारोबार अच्छा चल रहा है, उससे आपूर्ति बढ़ रही है. सो द सप्लाई गेट्स इफेक्टेड दैट वे. इफ यू स्पेंड मनी वेल, then the supply will come and you will not have an inflationary situation. But if you spend money badly, अगर आप खर्च खराब तरीके से कर रहे हैं, यानी लोगों के जेब में पैसा जा रहा है, बिचौलियों के, कॉन्ट्रैक्टर्स के, वो आम लोगों को नहीं पहुंच रहा है जो खर्च नहीं कर रहे हैं, या जिनका इंफ्रास्ट्रक्चर वगैरह पे कोई खास असर नहीं पड़ रहा है, तो इससे वो फिजूल खर्ची हो गई. तो इससे मांग तो बढ़ सकती है लेकिन आपूर्ति नहीं बढ़ सकती और इन्फ्लेशन हो सकता है. तो हमेशा ये याद रखने की जरूरत है कि क्या हम इस पे नजर रखे हुए हैं कि सरकार अपना पैसा कैसे खर्च कर रही है. Is it spending its money well? And we need to be very vigilant about how it spends its money, so that it cannot turn around and claim that we cannot do this because inflation will happen. If inflation is happening, that is the problem of money not being spent well enough. That is the point I'm trying to make. The second point is, ये हम लोग राजकोषीय घाटे के, फिस्कल डेफिसिट के और पैसा नहीं है इसके बार बार जाले में क्यों फंसते हैं. इसकी एक वजह यह है कि हम लोग ने अभी तक टैक्स सिस्टम, जो डायरेक्ट टैक्स सिस्टम है, मैं इनडायरेक्ट टैक्स की बात नहीं कर रहा, जीएसटी की बात नहीं कर रहा, द डायरेक्ट टैक्स ऑन इनकम्स बाय वेदर सैलरीज और self-employment incomes, business incomes, etc. We are not doing an adequate job of capturing them in our net. So there is a lot of unaccounted for income, which has always been India's problem. So if you look at our tax to GDP ratio, especially direct taxes to GDP, not total tax to GDP, the direct tax to GDP ratio is lower than it should be for our level of development. Meaning, ऐसी बहुत सारी इकोनॉमिक एक्टिविटी है जिससे लोगों को आय मिल रही है, लेकिन वो आय रिपोर्ट नहीं करते और उस पर टैक्स नहीं देते. इसमें बड़े कॉर्पोरेट्स भी आ गए जिनको एग्जेप्शंस देती रहती है सरकार, और इसमें बहुत सारे और धंधे भी आ गए, कारोबार भी आ गए, जो बड़े करोड़पति की बात नहीं कर रहा हूं मैं, जिनका इनकम हो सकता है साल में 20-30 लाख 40 लाख भी हो, यानी जो आजकल जो वेतन भोगी हैं जो कमा रहे हैं उतनी भी हो सकती है, लेकिन वो वेतन भोगी टैक्स में आ जाते हैं टीडीएस की वजह से, बिजनेस वाले नहीं आ पाते क्योंकि वो रिपोर्ट नहीं करते. तो इसकी तरफ जब ध्यान जाएगा, और सरकार थोड़ा बहुत ध्यान दे रही है, when that happens and the tax base widens, then we will have a lot more tax revenue with which to finance our expenditures. Right? So we cannot ignore the tax exemptions given to corporates or the various people who are escaping the tax net. So when we work on both of these, ensuring that government spending is of a good quality, so that inflationary pressures are not created, but rather that government spending is translating into a healthier, well-educated and more productive workforce. That is a very important part of this spending issue. And the other is increasing the tax base, which is also critical. So there is money in India. right? It's not that we can't afford social security for all our workers, or we can't afford to spend more on health, more on education, and so on. We can absolutely afford to do it. But the incomes are not distributed in such a way that the government has access, or they are not taxed in such a way that the government has access to spend on the public goods that are necessary. With the last point I will make, with the final result that the private goods and the public goods division in India is enormous. अगर आपके पास पैसा है तो आप कुछ भी खरीद सकते हैं, latest mobile, go on holidays, do whatever you want, you can do all of that private consumption. But when it comes to public goods, एक सड़क बनाने में, एक नाली ठीक करने में, पानी भेजने में हम लोग को दिक्कत होती है. So that public goods will not be done by merely people becoming rich. It will only happen when the government spends to do that. And for that, we have to ensure that the government has the revenues that it can spend in that way, and ensure that the government is not spending in a wasteful way. So I'll end with this much, and hear other people talk.
Thank you, Amit, for giving us a very good explanation of what we should be looking at in the budget, and also pointing out the fact that actually budgets are not, whether spending happens properly or not is what is important, rather than the amounts that are spent and whether it's productive spending or not. What would be called productive and what would be called unproductive in terms of in terms of the budget, I think maybe with the discussion will help us understand that more, and whether expenditure on workers is actually seen as being sort of always, whether the budget itself sees it as being productive and whether we also see it as being productive. That is something I think which is important. So we'll go on to the next speaker, which is our next speaker is Amitabh Guho, who's the secretary of the C2, and he is basically a person who's involved in the health movement. That's a very interesting thing, that should be involved in the health movement, and from that point, people's health movement, and from that point of view, he's looking at occupational safety and health also, and he's most importantly is the secretary of C2 of the of a very very large union, which is the C2, and he's going to talk to us about ESI, the ESIC, the Employment State Insurance Corporation, which is a method to kind of provide workers with health facilities and all the related kind of these things, and very different from the systems which governments are now coming up, which is the Swasthya Sathi in Bengal, or the Ayushman Bharat programs and all, which are insurance programs. So this is a very different thing, and which is enshrined in law and is given as a right to workers. So I would invite Mr. Comrade Guho to please speak now. Thank you.
Well, good morning everybody. आप सबको नमस्कार. मैंने थोड़ी कोई बिंदु रखेंगे आज का चर्चा का विषय में, लेकिन मैं पहले ये कहना चाहता हूँ, जो नोट सर्कुलेट किया है उसमें जो पोजीशन लिए हैं मैं सहमत नहीं हूँ, इसलिए कि इसमें एक नंबर पॉइंट जो दिया है कि ऑक्यूपेशनल आईडी कार्ड, इसका सवाल नहीं आता है, क्योंकि ऑक्यूपेशनल आईडी कार्ड ई श्रम पोर्टल का माध्यम से शुरू हो गया काम. दूसरा पॉइंट है पेंशन एज के बारे में 55 इयर्स का एक सीमित रखे हैं. इसमें रिटायरमेंट का बंदोबस्त है. अगर 55 इयर्स में हमने कुछ कॉम्पेंसेशन वगैरह मांगे कि पेंशन मांगे, तो सब लोग उसमें ही दौड़ेगा कि people will be compelled to retire by 55 years. Therefore, this demand should be avoided. Maternity benefit के बारे में हमारे बहन को है साना जो बोलेगी, I am not going to touch it. But one point is that maternity benefit is not universally available. Then there is a point that the figure given about the tax collection, direct tax collection from the rich, now Yeah, there has been certain points where we also do not agree about the minimum wages. The note says that there should be universal floor wage. We do not agree to that because we want that there should be a universal minimum wage, not floor wage. If floor based wage is prepared, government is trying to do that. उसमें क्या होगा, हर एक फ्लोर का अलग अलग वेतन होगा, इसलिए हमने मिनिमम वेज, तो मिनिमम फॉर सर्वाइवल, उसका तो जो ईआरसी दिया हुआ है उसको हिसाब से हम एक मिनिमम वेज, नेशनल मिनिमम वेज कर सकते हैं। इसलिए ट्रेड यूनियनों का डिमांड है नेशनल मिनिमम वेज एक डिक्लेयर करना, जो सबको देना पड़ेगा। एंड these are the points which I wanted to mention on the note. Now एक और भी एक बात हम करना चाहते हैं कि जनरल सिचुएशन क्या है ईएसआईएस का। ईएसआईएस का वेतन से कटौती होता है और ईएसआईएस का वो मालिक लोगों से भी पैसा लिया जाता है। अभी ईएसआईएस का हमने वेतन का जो डेफिनेशन दिए गए हैं कोड में, उसमें से आप देखें तो वेतन का उसमें जो वेज कोड जो बनाया है, वो वेज कोड का जो रूल्स बनाया है, रूल्स में क्लॉज नंबर 2Y उसमें बोला गया है कि वेतन का हिसाब होगा, उसमें ये ओवर टाइम अलाउंस, पेमेंट ऑन लीव एंड वेजेस, ये सारी उसमें से निकालना होगा। तब मतलब वेज का जो कंपोनेंट है वो छोटा हो जाएगा और इसके कारण कंपनियों को पैसा जो भर रहे हैं वो भरना कम हो जाएगा। अंत में क्या होगा, जब रिटायर करेगा टर्मिनल बेनिफिट जिसको कहा जाता है, पीएफ, ग्रेच्युटी वगैरह वगैरह, वो जो है वो कम हो जाएगा, मिलेगा कम, तो वर्कर का लॉस होगा, मालिकों का पैसा देना कम होगा। तो दिस इज दी रुपया मिनिमम मिलना चाहिए, जिसका 25,000 रुपया का सीमित किया जाए, उसको ईएसआई में अंतर्गत किया जाएगा। इसके जाएगा कुछ दिनों का बाद हम जो प्रेशर डाले, 21,000 रुपया तक उसका सीमित किया था ईएसआई में आने के लिए। इसका बावजूद ये बहुत बड़ी संख्या में अभी ईएसआई में कवर नहीं है। 20 से 15 साल में टोटल ईएसआई में कवरेज कितना था, 2.03 करोड़, लेकिन पीएफ में ये इसमें जो ईएसआई में 10 संख्यक वर्कर जहां है वो ईएसआई में आ जाता है, लेकिन पीएफ में इसको बढ़ा के रखे हैं, 20 वर्कर्स होना चाहिए कम से कम। तो उसके बावजूद भी पीएफ का हुआ है 3.71 करोड़, 3.71 करोड़ इज पीएफ कवरेज, एंड ईएसआई कवरेज से ज्यादा वो है, और इसके बावजूद भी 50% लोग ईएसआई कवरेज में नहीं है। ईएसआई का उपलब्ध होने के लिए जगह जो देखे हैं वो 393 डिस्ट्रिक्ट में है, सारी देश में नहीं है। और लेबर कॉन्फ्रेंस में 2015 साल इंडियन लेबर कॉन्फ्रेंस, जो लास्ट इंडियन लेबर कॉन्फ्रेंस हुआ है, उसमें ये पालित किया गया है कि रोड ट्रांसपोर्ट के इसको बढ़ाए, ये इसको सबको पास पहुंचने के लिए रोड ट्रांसपोर्ट, कंस्ट्रक्शन, सेल्फ एम्प्लॉयड पर्सन्स, ऑटो रिक्शा और ऐसे रिक्शा पुलर्स, इनको सारी कवर किया जाए। ये डिसीजन लिया हुआ था उस कॉन्फ्रेंस में। और 46 लेबर कॉन्फ्रेंस 2015 में जो हुआ वही लास्ट, उसका आगे कॉन्फ्रेंस हुआ ही नहीं, इंडियन लेबर कॉन्फ्रेंस को वो खारिज कर दिया है, उसमें उसी लेवल पे जाएगा ही नहीं, यही तो प्रॉब्लम है। तो देयरफॉर जितना डिसीजन लिया गया था इसको बढ़ाने के लिए, असंगठित क्षेत्र तक पहुंचने के लिए, वो भी नहीं हुआ। फिलहाल लेबर मिनिस्ट्री में मीटिंग बुलाया था, जहां पे हम लोगों को बुलाया था फिजिकल मीटिंग, जहां पे ई श्रम पोर्टल इंट्रोड्यूस किया था। तो हमने बोला ई श्रम पोर्टल में वो बोला हमने 90 विभिन्न प्रकार का प्रोफेशन का लोगों को हम लेंगे, रेडी वाले हमने लेंगे, डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स, ये सब हम लेंगे, ये बोले है लेबर मिनिस्टर। हमने बोला मिलेगा क्या ये बताइए। इन्होंने बोला कम से कम इनको तो हमने इंश्योरेंस कवरेज देंगे। तो इंश्योरेंस कवरेज देंगे तो उसमें तो प्रधानमंत्री का एक बीमा योजना है, आपका श्रम पोर्टल का माध्यम से जाने का क्या जरूरत है, वहां से उसका माध्यम से वो जा सकते हैं। बोले नहीं नहीं और भी कुछ सुविधाएं हम देंगे। आज 3 महीना हो गया उस मीटिंग का बाद, आज तक भी क्या सुविधा देंगे हैं डिस्कशन के लिए। हमारे फ्रेंड द्रेस भी बोलेंगे नरेगा का स्थिति में, लेकिन एक ही बात कहना है, नरेगा के लिए जो बजट था वो बजट को कम कर दिया है। तो इसलिए दिस बजट इज ए स्क्वीजिंग बजट एंड फर्दर प्रॉब्लम इज कमिंग कि ये लोग जो बोले हैं कि ईएसआई सिस्टम को मेडिक्लेम सिस्टम पे ले जाएंगे। कारण क्या है, ईएसआई में जो फैसिलिटीज है वो सारी सुविधाएं आपका मेडिक्लेम में नहीं होगा। मेडिक्लेम अगर करे उसमें सीमित रखे तो आउट पेशेंट का कोई इलाज नहीं, पैसा नहीं मिलेगा। मेडिक्लेम अगर करे तो उसमें आपका जो वेज कॉम्पेंसेशन, मान लीजिए कि कोई व्यक्ति का एक्सीडेंट हुआ है, घर पे रहे हैं, काम पे नहीं जा रहा है, उसका वेतन लंबा समय तक अगर खराब रहे, घर पे रहे कि हॉस्पिटल में रहे, तो उसका वेतन जो है वो वेतन ईएसआई से मिलता है, मेडिक्लेम का भी देते हैं। और भी दूसरा प्रपोजल जो है कि सारी ईएसआई स्कीम को इंश्योरेंस बेस में ट्रांसफर कर देगा। तो इंश्योरेंस बेस में ट्रांसफर करेगा तो इनका एक तो है जो बीमार का लिस्ट होगा, जिस बीमार के लिए ईएसआई में लिस्ट किया हुआ है वो सारी बीमार रहेगा नहीं, कम हो। जिसको लागू ट्रीटमेंट के लिए, जहां पे आपको किडनी का बीमार, जहां पे हार्ट का बीमार, ये सारी होता है, वहां पे आपको पहुंचने के लिए रजिस्ट्रेशन कराना पड़ेगा। और रजिस्ट्रेशन प्रोसेस ऐसा है कि सारी लोग वहां तक पहुंच नहीं पाए। तो इसलिए अभी का जो सिस्टम है, अभी पूरा लागू नहीं किया है, जो सिस्टम है उसको भी वर्कर को डिप्राइव करने के लिए
Amitabh da,
बीमार का
after Amitabh da, you have 2 minutes more, please, if you can.
या सो उसमें भी चेंज डाले हैं, तो सुविधाएं जितने मिल रहा था वो सुविधाएं तक बड़ी संख्या में कटौती होगा। और एक चीज आपको जानकारी के लिए रखता हूं, ये फंड का बारे में हमारे प्रीवियस स्पीकर पहले जो बोले हैं, उन्होंने कोई जगह दिखाया है कि फंड का कमी नहीं है। फंड कमी क्या है, अभी देखिए फंड का बारे में 2013-14 में ईएसआईएस का इनकम ओवर एक्सपेंस खर्चा जो हुआ है और जिसका मिला है उसका जो डिफरेंस है वो था 5,420 करोड़। मतलब ईएसआई सुविधाएं देने का बावजूद इनका 5,420 करोड़ है। 2015 में जो है वो पहुंच गया था 5,997 करोड़। और इसलिए अभी तक जो इनका धन जमा हुआ है ये इसका पास 2 साल में, वो 2 सालों में जो पहुंचा था वो है 36,079 करोड़। बाद में 2015 में 36,000 पहुंच गया है 42,000 करोड़। इतना पैसा इनके पास है, पैसा का तो कमी नहीं है। तो इसको फिर भी ये सुविधाएं छाटनी करना क्यों चाहते हैं? चाहते हैं कि इंश्योरेंस सिस्टम पे इसको चेंज कर दे ताकि इंश्योरेंस कंपनियों का फायदा हो। और इंश्योरेंस कंपनी में विदेशी इंश्योरेंस कंपनी भी आने के लिए आ रहा है, आ गया है, सारी रास्ता तैयारी रखे हैं। इसी स्थिति में जो पोजीशन होगा उस पोजीशन में सबसे बड़ा प्रॉब्लम है कि वर्कर का सुविधाएं कम होगा और क्षेत्र कम से कम ये छोटा कर देगा. There will be severe squeezing of the coverage. There will be less advantages to the workers. So therefore, we, the trade unions, we are prepared for resisting it. We are prepared to fighting it, and that's why all our demands together, all the 10 central trade unions together, or we are going for a national 2-day strike on 28th and 29th March. So we are prepared for bigger struggle. We are prepared to resist all these attempts, anti-worker attempts by the government. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Amitabh. आपने जो बोला, it kind of resonates with our experience here. We have an insurance plan called Swasthya Sathi here, and what we are seeing is that it's a universal plan, almost universal. But what we are seeing is a mushrooming of nursing homes and a mushrooming of private sector institutions, which are kind of just used for hospitalization, and no other facilities are available for workers or for poorer people. While ESI would cover many of these things, like for example, sickness benefit also would be there, outdoor treatment would be there, a lot of other things would be there. So this very resonates with our experience a lot, and this whole business of the ESI having a lot of money but not caring to a large section of workers, that is also true. ESI facilities, at least in Bengal, are very good, and a lot of workers would benefit from it, and they have the money to give it to us also. Lekin informal sector ke liye extend nahi kar rahe hain. So I would thank you, Amitabh, for your intervention. And now we will go on to the next speaker, which again is an old friend, John Drays, and he is going to be speaking on NREGA and on employment and pensions. And I hope I've got the title right, because there was some correspondence about changing it. John is very well known to all of us, and he's like one of the architects of the NREGA also, and has been very much involved in the movement to get it passed and to get it implemented. And we still all work together on this particular issue and on other issues of social security. So and his inputs will be very valuable for us here. I would like to invite John to speak now. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Anuradha. The correct title is actually social assistance, and I will include NREGA under social assistance. साथियों माफ कीजिए, मैं अपनी बात इंग्लिश में ही रखूंगा, क्योंकि मैंने हिंदी में बात करने की तैयारी नहीं की और तैयारी के बिना इतना आसान नहीं है. So I'll proceed in English with apologies for those who would have preferred Hindi. I will not have a lot to say on the budget itself because I have not studied it, but I would rather speak about the larger attack against social assistance, and especially on rights-based social legislations like the Food Security Act, the Employment Guarantee Act, or for that matter, even the Right to Information Act, that has been going on now for many years, because the annual setbacks that we are seeing year after year in the annual budgets are part of a more long-term and sustained attack on social assistance that goes back at least to the first full budget of the Modi government in 2015. Before that, I want to make a larger point, which is that if we want to understand economic policy and social policy today, I think we have to understand the basics of Hindu nationalism, which is the ideology of the central government and also, of course, of the RSS, which is more or less controlling the party in power. So a few aspects of Hindu nationalism that are relevant, I think, for this discussion is, first of all, that Hindu nationalism is hostile to rationality and the scientific spirit, basically because it's based on the propagation of all kinds of irrational ideas, and therefore critical inquiry is a threat to Hindu nationalism. And we can see this hostility to rationality reflected also in economic policy, for example, in the destruction of the statistical system that has been going on now for several years, of course, in demonetization, which is one of the most irrational and absurd economic moves one can imagine. We can see it in the sidelining of almost all the credible economic advisors in the last few years in favor of yes men and yes women who are pandering to those in power. We can see it in the deterioration of the annual economic surveys to the point that they are not worth reading anymore. There is no logic and no rhyme or reason in the economic policies of the BJP government. It's very hard to understand what these economic policies are about. The only thing that is very clear is that the Modi government likes business. That is the A to Z of its economic philosophy. And one reason for that is that it's the business sector that is bankrolling Hindu nationalism at the moment. And therefore, there's a relation of mutual support between the business sector and Hindu nationalists. Second point relevant for this discussion is that there is no place for rights in Hindu nationalism. It's all about your duties and what you can do for, not for yourself, but for the nation, the Hindu Rashtra, increasingly identified now with the government and even with the BJP. And the third point, which is less obvious and not everyone may agree with, is that we can think of the driving force of Hindu nationalism in recent years or recent decades as a kind of revolt of the upper castes against democracy and against the demands of democracy. It's basically an attempt to restore the traditional social order, or what they think is the traditional social order, a social order that places them, the upper caste, at the top. And the role of the caste system in this social order is to enable the upper castes to live off the labor of others. I think that helps to explain the contempt that we are seeing for the working class today, the migrant crisis that happened last year, the plight of domestic workers, and for that matter, even the schooling crisis. I mean, all this is based on the notion that these people really don't matter. Their role is to service the privileged, and therefore their own needs and demands and rights are of no importance in themselves. And that helps to explain also why in the budget this year there's hardly any provision of interest for working people, or for that matter for children. I was really shocked this morning. I looked at what the budget speech says on children, and there's virtually nothing. There's a passing remark on the schooling crisis, which is actually a monumental crisis, maybe worse than the economic crisis or the health crisis, because it will affect a generation of children for life. And in response to that, the finance minister is proposing to launch a series of TV channels to facilitate education. And that is after a survey earlier this year showed that the most ineffective mode of education at the moment, even worse than online education, is TV channels. They have virtually no impact on children. Anyway, coming to social assistance, the social assistance framework for the informal sector today basically has 5 pillars. It's not enough, but that is what we have at the moment. These 5 pillars are, first of all, the Employment Guarantee Act, the MNREGA. Secondly, the public distribution system. Thirdly, social security pensions, including the National Social Assistance Program, which includes, quite importantly, the National Family Benefit Scheme. Fourthly, maternity entitlements. And fifth, programs for children, including especially the nutrition programs under ICDS and midday meals. Now, all of them have come under severe attack in recent years and also in this year's budget, with the partial exception of the public distribution system, but mainly because the food stocks keep growing and the government doesn't know what to do with the excess food stocks, so it keeps releasing them in particular at the moment under PMGKY. I think other speakers will speak in more details about these programs, so I'll just very briefly say a few words about each of them. First of all, the biggest attack by far is on children's programs. Some of you may have seen tweets that were released yesterday and today by the Rose Scholars handle, which show that in real terms, the budget, the central contribution to midday meals has dropped by about 50% since 2015. Now, this is unimaginable. I mean, how are the schools and the cooks supposed to provide a nutritious meal today with half of the budget that they had in real terms 7 years ago. For ICDS, it's about 40% reduction in real terms. So this is absolutely catastrophic. And as I said, this is barely being noticed, not only by the finance minister or by the government, but even by the opposition parties and by the society at large. That's the biggest attack at the moment. Secondly, MNREGA, I think you all know that there's now a vicious cycle of underfunding and delays in wage payments, which is threatening to destroy the entire program. Every year, the central government underfunds the program, and then what happens is that later in the year, around the month of September or October, the funds run out. Then some people make noise, and then there's a supplementary allocation. Meanwhile, the wages don't get paid for months, and then the supplementary allocation is not adequate to pay the arrears, and so the unpaid wages get carried over to the next year, and then the cycle continues again and again. This is something that we must demand should stop. There must be payment within 15 days under all circumstances as per the provisions of the Act. And what is happening, this annual vicious circle of underfunding and delays in payments is absolutely contrary to the spirit and the letter, for that matter, of the Employment Guarantee Act. Remember, in the Act, there's a provision not only for a central employment guarantee fund, but also for state employment guarantee funds. And the idea of the central employment guarantee fund was that it would be a permanent, non-lapsable fund that would ensure that there is always money to pay the workers. But today we have a very, very abnormal payment system where people are made to work without a guarantee that the funds are there for them to be paid. And so naturally, from time to time, the funds run out, and then the delays happen and sometimes continue for many months. I think we must insist on funds being available at all times and payments being made within 15 days. The third pillar is the social security pensions. Again, huge attack. As you probably know, the central contribution to old age pensions has stagnated at a measly 200 rupees per month for a full 15 years now. This is in money terms, so in real terms, it would have declined by much more than 50%. The coverage of pensions is also stagnating. The budgets are also stagnating. So basically, there's a de facto sidelining or withdrawing of these pension programs. And the reason is that the central government is trying to promote contributory schemes instead, like the Atal Pension Yojana, APY, which are of very little interest to the poorest people, because the poorest people don't have much power to save, and nor do they have any good reason to trust the government with their savings. I should mention in passing also that the Atal Pension Yojana, so far as I know, has no provision for disability or disability pensions. So when the pension schemes under the National Social Assistance Program, including also, by the way, the National Family Benefit Schemes, when all these schemes are de facto being phased out in favor of a contributive scheme like APY, we are also seeing a de facto phasing out of disability pensions and survivor benefits. The fourth pillar is maternity entitlements. I think there's another speaker who will speak about that, but briefly, just to remind you, the maternity benefit scheme PMMVY, Pradhan Mantri Matru Vandana Yojana, is a violation, a gross violation of the National Food Security Act, because it restricts maternity benefits to one child, the so-called first living child, and also arbitrarily reduces the benefits from the mandatory minimum of 6,000 rupees to 5,000 rupees per child. This has been going on for many years. I don't understand how the Supreme Court allows the government to violate the act so blatantly. And even in terms of this restricted norm of one child per woman and 5,000 rupees per child, the coverage, the actual coverage is very patchy, and I think has also reduced in the last couple of years because of the COVID crisis and the Anganwadi is being closed. So again, huge attack. And finally, the PDS, as I said, that has survived somehow, and in fact, in the last 2 years, expanded. The distribution of food grain under the PDS has expanded, but mainly, as I said, because the government doesn't know where to put the excess stocks. At the time when the National Food Security Act was being framed, the central government, and in particular the Planning Commission and the Finance Ministry, took the view that that the level of procurement would not or should not exceed 60 million tons per year, and that became a kind of de facto constraint on the drafting of the act. As it turned out, procurement actually continued to increase after that to 70 million tons per year, 80 million tons, now more than 90 million tons. And so there's a chronic imbalance now between procurement and distribution, which is reflected in ballooning food stocks. And it is as an ad hoc response to these ballooning food stocks that the government has now increased the levels of distribution in the last 2 years. Which actually creates a real anomaly in the system, that those who already had a ration card for the time being are getting double what they were getting earlier, but those who don't have a ration card are still getting nothing. And that creates, of course, an enormous injustice. So I think it's very important to use the opportunity of these enhanced levels of procurement to expand the coverage of the PDS and to ensure that no poor households are excluded. So these are some of the recent trends. I think I'm coming to the end of my 10 minutes. So there's some background noise. Okay, so just to conclude, the pattern is very clear across the board. There's a huge attack on social assistance, which needs to be exposed and opposed tooth and nail. Thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah. So
Sorry.
I mean, as usual, John's, especially the first part, the analysis was very, very interesting and very nice to listen to, and very new, in fact. And I'm very thankful to you for that analysis, and of course, of all the other things that you've said about the schemes also, which is very good and very enlightening. So I'd like to now hand over to Chandan. Chandan, please take over because I have to leave for another meeting, with apologies to all of you.
Yes.
I have to go somewhere else. So Chandan, please take over. Thank you so much. Thank you.
Thank you, John, for the very, very powerful analysis. I think there are some questions for you on the chat box, but I want to come back after all the presentations are made. So please stay tuned. So very quickly, going to Professor K.P. Kannan. Professor K.P. Kannan is also, we all know him, he's a very renowned economist. He was a full-time member of NCUS, National Commission for Enterprise and Unorganised Sector, popularly known as Arjun Sengupta Commission Report. And he's currently the chair of the Laurie Baker Center in Kerala. So Kannan sir, floor is yours, sir. Kannan sir, you have to unmute. Yeah, yes. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Kannan sir. Yes, we can hear you.
Thank you very much, Chandan and other organizers of this meeting. Okay. All right. And other organizers of this meeting. For my own reasons, I have not been in touch with the WPC for some time, and that's due to my personal inconvenience. I seek your apology. I make my apology for that. But let me say a few words in the same spirit as our previous speakers, particularly Jean. because he focused, rightly so in my view, on the larger question of social assistance that he listed as 5. Out of those 5, 4 are on the basis of entitlements of individuals or families. Only 1 is meant for work, that is NREGA. So you can say it is meant for people who are willing to work. I'm going to talk to you about the informal workers in particular, who form now, as the cliche goes, 80% of our total workers in the economy. And there is also a significant presence of informal workers in the formal sector. Excuse me. As far as the union budget is concerned, I did not go through the entire documents. It was not at all necessary for that, because from a worker's point of view, I did not see, as my previous speaker suggested, many offers. In fact, there has been, as Jean pointed out, certain reduction, not only in the NREGA, but in other heads that indirectly affects the poorer families in this country, that I shall come to later. Now, Amit said about the larger question of tax to GDP ratio and the expenditure of the government, and said if there is a gap, they will have to borrow. He also said there are problems of tax collection and so on. So to get a larger picture right, any answer from the government, whether it is NDA or UPA, that there are no financial resource for the government is a blatant lie, because the government is charged with collecting the taxes that are due to the government and spend it in a way as per their, of course, that will reflect their political ideology. So the budget is also a mirror of ideology. But from the point of view of tax collection, what the government of India is collecting is around 10% of the national income. That comes to around 39.3 lakh crores. So close to 40 lakh crores. Now, the states as a whole, they collect around 7.5% of the national income. So it comes to around 17%. 17 to 17.5% of the national income is collected as taxes and non-taxes to both the central and state governments. Now, there are studies internationally about the ability of the countries or their governments to realize their tax income. And according to some of the studies, India as a country with a certain level of national income and per capita income is eminently placed to collect around 25% of its national income as public resources in the form of taxes and non-taxes. So there is a gap between what could be collected, taxed, that is at 25%, and what is being taxed, 17%. So you have a gap of 8% of the national income that could have been collected by the government of India and different states. That 8% of the national income would come to around 8%, yes, around 32 lakh crores. Now you may say that it's not feasible to collect all that immediately. So let's say that if half of that could be collected, the government of India and the state governments will find that they have an additional resource of 16 lakh crores of rupees. If only they collect, instead of 25%, at least 21% of the nation's or the income. I'm not able to include the black money here because these are official statistics. So we are only working with official data. So if the tax money problem is also tackled, and brought to the tax net, you can then imagine what will be the increase in the absolute amount of public resources. And why they are not doing so is part of an ideology. And that ideology is a particular variety of neoliberal ideology, in which the government is supposed to be doing as little as possible and leaving most of the things, including now defense production, to the private sector. And therefore, the society will be governed by market exchange of what they call demand and supply. Now, that doesn't happen as per the textbook, you know, that even in capitalist countries of the West, the share of taxes and other incomes collected for the government goes well beyond 25%. I think the OECD average is around 26% or so. There are countries like the Scandinavian countries where they collect as high as 40% of the national income as government revenue and provide an extensive array of welfare and social assistance to the entire population from cradle to the grave. So that is one model. So it is not that we don't have a model in a democratic setup. The second point I want to bring out is that from the point of view of the informal workers, they are always at the receiving end. Formal sector workers, of course, have some entitlements, although in many places they are always under attack. But formal sector workers form themselves into a distinct group. Socially speaking, most of them come from the socially advantaged groups, mostly urban oriented, educated, and therefore they are able to get into secure public and private employment, even if it is not as secure as one would like. As in the case of information technology sector, they do make a good remuneration there. So that reality is before us. What we don't have is the minimum of protection to the informal workers in the informal sector. And informal workers and informal sector is almost synonymous because there is hardly any formal worker category in the informal sector, maybe 0.2%, 0.3%, negligible percent or so. So that is the kind of situation. So we need to understand from a larger point of the country's working people that the formal sector workers have to realize that they are sitting in a sea of informal sector workers. Perhaps you may call it the very great reserve army of labor. This is not the unemployed, this is the employed but insecure in all senses of the term. It is this sea of people, which, as I said, that share remains the same, whether it is 10 years ago, 20 years ago, even now, around 80% of the total workers. We have something like, if you exclude people who are above 60, and rest because we are advocating an elderly pension for them, if you take the working age group of 15 to 59, we have around 465 million workers in this country. And 80% of them are the people that I am talking about. The National Commission for Enterprises in the Unorganized Sector, or basically it's the National Commission for the Unorganized Workers, which Arjun Sen Gupta headed, late and Arjun Sen Gupta headed. We made a framework and gave it to the government, the UPA, and that was promptly, I would say, cannibalized by people who were presiding over the Finance Ministry and the Planning Commission in the UPA government. So the example before the NDA is of a kind where you can pick and choose. They did not accept the right to minimum protection of the informal workers who are slogging it out, not only for their livelihood, and indirectly to the economy by providing all kinds of services. Of course, some of them, the former finance minister, for example, is now very eloquent about criticizing the current government, rightly so. but I don't know how much credibility that he is actually carrying, given the performance that he gave us in the UPA 1 and UPA 2. So the task is much larger, and that's what I want to underline. The National Commission suggested a framework with 3 pillars. I would say 4 pillars. One pillar was already there, as Jean mentioned, the National Employment Guarantee Scheme. We said we need 3 pillars. One is the legislation for national minimum wage. Now, let me make it very clear here. In a country like India, both central government and the state government have the right to legislate on minimum wage. So the situation in Punjab for a certain kind of minimum wage is not the same as the situation in Bihar or Orissa, or for that matter in Kerala. So there will be differences, and also industry or occupation-wise differences. But the Commission's idea of national minimum wage was that a national minimum wage will be that wage below which there will not be any legislation in any part of India. That means it is like a floor. If you don't want to call it a floor, don't call it. But it is a minimum wage that is applicable to all the workers in this country, below which you cannot set your regional minimum wage. You can set it above. For example, in Punjab, Haryana, I'm giving an example, and Kerala, the market wage is often higher than the minimum wage set by the government of India. So therefore, it is not in their interest to level down the already existing wage. They can always enjoy a higher minimum wage, but no minimum wage will be less than the national minimum wage. We now have in 2017 committee report of Satpathy committee report, which worked out. I went into some detail reading it and found it interesting that 375 rupees per day as on 2017. That comes to around 500 rupees at today's prices. And that committee appointed by this NDA government, their own people, did not accept that recommendation. In fact, they made it into a sham by declaring a minimum wage which was exactly half of the recommended minimum wage of 176, and they added 2 rupees to it as a joke and made it 178 in 2018-19 or so. So that's the situation. That's a big task, a big battle, which I think all trade unions will have to fight it out. But before fighting, they will also carry the support of the large pool of informal workers in this country, who most of whom are not yet organized, let alone in a position to effectively demand their rights. So that's about the minimum wage. The second pillar that the National Commission proposed was a national minimum social security for workers. I'm not confusing here with the social assistance, which Jean explained, because that's outside of it, like one to the children and to the mothers and to the old age. And so that is citizenship rights. I'm talking about the national social security for workers who are informal workers or informal sector workers. And that we made a plan in which those who are in the BPL category would not have to give a contribution. That will be paid by the government. They will only make an entry fee, and others could be made to pay a contribution along with a contribution from the employer and the government. But there is a catch. The catch is for the informal sector, among all the workers, that's around 80% for 65, that will be 370 million or so. Only 17% of them have an identifiable employer, because others are just footloose. They are moved from one to the other, not just migrant labor, even in rural areas, from one job to another. So you don't have a regular employer. So we made the recommendation for such people. The government, the state government, and the central government should share the responsibility. Now, that included health, accident and death, and an old age pension for workers. And of course, the health found itself in a very sort of a way, this RSBY, Rashtriya Swasthya Bima Yojana by Mr. Chidambaram, ignoring our larger recommendations, and that's a different story. The third pillar of that was a minimum working condition. Now we are talking about the labor codes and minimum working conditions, where we are now talking about the government has already gone back by relaxing the minimum number of working hours and various other kinds of things. So we said we should have a minimum conditions of work, whether it is the hours of work, the number of holidays which are common to all the workers, that should be specified, and kind of leave, and those kinds of things should be there. So it is this.
You please conclude in 1-2 minutes, sir. Please, sorry, sir.
I will conclude in 2 minutes or even
Okay.
1.
Okay.
So this is in this 3 pillars that you are able to level up the existing condition of the informal sector workers and their families. So it's a leveling up strategy, for which I already said at that time the costs were so low, only 0.5% of national income and around 4 or 5% of the national budget. And recently Santosh Mehrotra worked on a similar kind of social security, and his numbers show that it will be around 0.7% of the national, it will not exceed 0.7% of the national income or 4 or 5% of the national budget. So these are doable things. And I think a forum like WPC could articulate this in a very logical and convincing manner, first among the workers itself, and get their support, and also convert this, try its best to convert this, to get it included in the political agenda of parties who are favorable or pro-people, pro-workers. And I think if that groundwork can be done in a sustained manner, we could hope for some final positive outcomes. Thank you very much. I'm sorry if I've taken more time than I was supposed to. Thank you.
No, don't say sorry, Kannan sir. I mean, we would have loved to hear you more, but just about the time constraints. But I think it's very, very detailed analysis. I mean, in fact, I have just shared the Santosh Mehrotra's article on the chat box. He has done a very good calculation. It's just that the amount he has proposed, about 1.37 trillion rupees, we also want to see the breakup of that, how he has calculated, which is not reflecting in the Wire article. So hopefully we'll ask him that if he can share those details with that. So I don't want to take much time, because we have a lot of questions also now to ask all the speakers. So quickly going to our comrade Shehnaz. And Shehnaz Rafiq, some of the people who also already know her. She's the National Secretary of INTUC, a Central Trade Union of India, and she has worked intensively on the issues of women informal workers. She has also served in the various capacity at Industry All, a global trade union federation that represents 50 million workers in 140 countries. Sister Shehnaz, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chandan. Thank you so much. With all due regards to my seniors over here and to all the eminent speakers. And John had really spoken his heart out and literally poured out all my thoughts also into it. And thank you for that brief. And I'm sure we are running short of time. So I would try to be precise and focus on some of the very important points which I would like to highlight. First of all, thank you WPC for taking this initiative, and because usually what happens, majority of the मैं हिंदी में भी बीच में बोलूंगी, क्योंकि ज्यादातर ट्रेड यूनियन के भी लोग मैं कहूंगी कि इस बात से वाकिफ नहीं है कि किस तरह से इनकम और डिस्ट्रीब्यूशन और एक्सपेंडिचर को हम कैलकुलेट करें। तो इसलिए ये बहुत जरूरी होता है कि बीच बीच में इस तरह की ट्रेनिंग्स किए जाए, और इसीलिए मैं WPC की आभारी हूँ। मैं हम लोग 5-6 साल से एक साथ काम कर रहे हैं और देख रहे हैं कि किस तरह से आप लोग अपने डॉक्यूमेंटेशंस को आगे बढ़ा रहे हैं। और अमिताभ बुहदा ने एक बहुत अच्छी बात पॉइंट आउट की थी आपके फाइनेंशियल कॉस्ट वाले में, और उसमें मैं भी थोड़ा सा ऐड ऑन करना चाहूंगी। जो मैटरनिटी बेनिफिट्स की बात आपने रखी, the points which you said. I agree with John. Just the gravest thing that's happening in this Maternity Act is the violation of Food Security Act, which is a very, very serious issue, and nobody is taking note to it. And we are, even trade unions, frankly telling you, even trade unions are not taking a lead on this, which is a very grave issue. If we see the section 20 of the code, which vests the right to payment of maternity benefit in every woman who has actually worked for a minimum period of 80 days in the 12 months immediately preceding the date of her expected delivery, such eligible female employees are entitled to maternity benefit of 26 weeks, of which not more than 8 weeks shall precede the expected date of her delivery. Therefore, the code does not provide any extended quantum of maternity benefit or leave. The code must instead imbibe universal nature of maternity benefits. Otherwise, a majority of women who work in the unorganized sector, अब आप तो समझ ही गए हैं कि unorganized हम किसको कह रहे हैं, only 2%, 3% are organized now. बाकी सब unorganized हैं. जो organized sector में भी हैं, I'm sorry to say, वो भी कॉन्ट्रैक्ट बेसिस में है, और हम किसकी बात कर रहे हैं, और हम जो ख्वाब वो सरकार हमें दिखा रही है, उस ख्वाब को हम एक ढांचा बना के अपने सामने रख के वी आर लुकिंग इनटू दैट पर्सपेक्टिव. सो इफ एंड इन डेज टू कम, आने वाले दिनों में भी अब एफटीए को वो लोग पूर्ण रूप से लागू कर देंगे, तो क्या होगा, अप्रेंटिसशिप एक्ट और भी रिवाइज्ड होके आ जाएगा, तो ये कहेंगे कि कैजुअल वर्कर्स की तादाद या इनफॉर्मल वर्कर्स की तादाद कहें, या प्रिकेरियस वर्कर की, जो भी नई टर्म आप इसमें ऐड कर लें, क्योंकि टर्म्स और टर्मिनोलॉजीज में ही भाजपा सरकार ने, मौजूदा सरकार ने हमें नचाया है और नचा रहे हैं. I'm sorry, I'm little blunt, but this is the only word that I can say, that they are using different terminologies, and we are falling prey to these terminologies. So there is no provision or mention of how women's representation would be ensured in equal numbers on the central board also. The code provides no framework of including female representation or scheduled caste, scheduled tribe, minorities, OBCs representation in the board of trustees of EPFO, in the unorganized board, workers board. There is no specificity of how sectoral representation would be ensured. बहुत सही कहा था, ई श्रम पोर्टल के बारे में भी उन्होंने बना तो दिया ई श्रम पोर्टल. They are talking about, but what are they talking? They don't have a data yet. और ई श्रम पोर्टल में भी जो रजिस्ट्रेशन हो रही है, do you think it is an authentic registration that's going on in the ई श्रम portal? Last month I was in Jharkhand because I belong to that state. I was in Jharkhand and I work in the community. तो मैं जब बस्ती में गई तो जो हाउसवाइफ्स हैं वो कह रही थी कि 50 रुपया दे के ई श्रम कार्ड बन रहा है, जॉब कार्ड बन रहा है. I said लेकिन तुम तो काम नहीं करती हो, तो तुम्हें क्या फायदा? नहीं सरकार बना रही है, बोली है बहुत फायदा होगा, इसमें बहुत पैसा आएगा. तो such kind of rumors are being spread around, और लोगों को लग रहा है कि अगर कार्ड बन रहा है तो चलो इसमें जाके अपना दाखिला करा लें. So and they are very smartly claiming कि इतने करोड़ का registration हो गया है. That means they still do not have any data of the unorganized sector. Now, Maternity Leave Act applies to establishments like factories, corporates, mines, plantations, shops, Establishment Act. But what about the women who are being left in the other sectors? जो होम बेस्ड हैं, जो डोमेस्टिक वर्कर्स हैं, लेदर एंड टैनरी सेक्टर में वर्क कर रहे हैं, फिशरी में वर्क कर रहे हैं, एग्रीकल्चर में वर्क कर रहे हैं, मैन्युफैक्चरिंग सेक्टर के डाउनस्ट्रीम में वर्क कर रहे हैं, शिप ब्रेकिंग, शिप रिसाइकलिंग के डाउनस्ट्रीम में वर्क कर रहे हैं. क्या वो प्रेग्नेंट नहीं होंगी? क्या उनके बच्चे नहीं होंगे? तो क्या उनको क्या सुविधा दे रही है सरकार? क्या सोच रखती है सरकार उसके बारे में? तो ये हमारे लिए बहुत ही सोचने का विषय है. And we literally need to see, and it's a very serious. I'm sorry, I've not started the video. I'm very sorry. I'm very sorry. Sorry. So it's a really serious concern that the government actually lacks the focus on nutrition, on health, and basic education, rightly told by my previous speakers. And when we talk about basic early childhood care, we talk about early childhood education. It's very. I'm sorry.
No, continue.
Should I
Continue. Sorry. No, continue, please.
So which is immensely important as the country is going through a pandemic, and now new variants are coming into it, and nobody knows what will be the future of work now, and how the country will sail through it, and what will be the plight of the workers. So despite the impact of COVID-19 on hunger and malnutrition in children, the reports of increasing violence and rapes on women, but the budget 22-23 for the Ministry of Women Child Development saw a slight increase of merely 3%. Now, Mission Vatsalya, only 0.04% of the total budget. Then Mission Shakti, 0.08% of the total budget of 22-23. Shaksham Anganwadi and Poshan 2.0, only 0.5% of the total budget. So the union budget was disheartening last year, and now it has been more disgusting this year. The Maternity Benefit Act will be repealed by the central government, and all its provisions have been transplanted also into the Code on Social Security. And I'm sure, Chandan, we have discussed about it several times. And under Social Security Code 2020, the duties of enforcing the provisions of the code has been given a new authority now. The inspector, facilitator. Who are these people? क्या करेंगे वो होंगे कौन? यही एम्प्लॉयर्स के लोग होंगे. आज जो आंगनवाड़ी के लोग इतने बड़ी तादाद में हर स्टेट में स्ट्राइक पे गई हुई है, क्यों गई हुई है? क्योंकि ये लोग जिस तरह से येलो यूनियंस होते हैं ना हमारे ट्रेड यूनियन में, देयर आर येलो यूनियंस, तो उसी तरह से आंगनवाड़ी के भी लोगों को ऐसे फॉल्स लोग क्रिएट किए गए हैं, जो लोग जाके बोलते हैं कि नहीं हमारे यहाँ सब गुडी गुडी है, सब अच्छा अच्छा है. बट एक्चुअल हकीकत में क्या है? जो पोषण मिलना चाहिए गर्भवती महिला को वो नहीं है. वो चला जा रहा है मुखिया के घर में, वार्ड काउंसिलर के घर में. आप ग्रामीण क्षेत्र में जाके देखिए. अभी बात कर रहे थे अमिताभ दा, बहुत अच्छी बात उन्होंने रखी कि ईपीएफ के बारे में और ईएसआई के बारे में. ईएसआई का आप ग्रामीण में जाइए ना, अर्बन का तो बुरा हाल है ही है, उसमें तो कोई दो राय नहीं है. स्कूल्स में टीचर्स नहीं है, हॉस्पिटल्स में डॉक्टर्स नहीं है, डॉक्टर्स है तो दवा नहीं है. तो जब ये हालात अगर अर्बन क्षेत्रों में है, तो ग्रामीण का तो बद से बुरा हाल है. They are very bad. ESIC are very badly managed hospitals only in towns. They are lacking in rural areas. No specialized treatments. They lack medicines. They give priority to only, some attendants are made. Recently, I had a meeting with the health minister of Jharkhand, Mr. Banna Gupta, a very good friend of mine. I said कि यहाँ का जो महात्मा गांधी हॉस्पिटल है, and in that the pregnant women की जो delivery ward है, it is in a very dilapidated condition. मतलब किसी वक्त भी वो इमारत झरझर करके वो गिर पड़ेगा, और कब गिरेगा और कितने लोग उसमें मरेंगे उसकी कोई मैंने कह नहीं सकता है. And he said that we have got a budget and we are going to work on it. तो सोचिए कि क्या सोच है मौजूदा सरकार की. और लेबर तो वैसे ही ना घर का है ना घाट का है, और उसमें इनफॉर्मेलिटी वो और भी ज्यादा उसको पीड़ित बनाता है. So if we see, I'm sorry, you please tell me if I exceed my limit. So COVID-19 has literally highlighted the urgency of providing universal free healthcare. We need to have this. And the pandemic has prompted us to revisit the importance and necessity of universal social security. We have to demand this. It's high time that we demand it. Very rightly said by Amitabh Da, we all 10 central trade unions are definitely looking forward for this 2 days strike. But frankly speaking, after being in this trade union movement from the grassroots level to the international and then now back to my own home union, क्या हम ये 2 दिवसीय स्ट्राइक में कुछ महा चेंज ला पाएंगे? I don't think so. It will just be a significant one. But yes, at least there will be some revolt by the 10 trade unions. And I would request WPC also to join hands with these 10 central trade unions, at least come to one consensus, ताकि हम universal social security की demand करें. Because even ITUC, we are affiliate of ITUC, even ITUC, Sharan Baro also has quoted that we need to demand for a universal social security, social protection flow. क्योंकि अगर वो नहीं हम सोचेंगे तो हम अपने बाकी जो मौजूदा informal workers हैं उन तक क्या पहुंचाएंगे? हम कितनी बड़ी-बड़ी बातें करते हैं. We talk such big things. Right, Amitabh Das said कि 2015 से ILC ही नहीं हुआ है. It has been scrapped off. And Chandan, even you might have visited ILO several times. Do you think the workers are made to sit in front and able to speak over there? Never. They never get an opportunity to speak. I have visited ILO several times and I've seen that they are never given an opportunity. And we are talking about making such big changes. So let's start from the scrap. Let's start from the scrap. Let's talk about the reality and why we are now demanding for a universal social security. We are seeing this growing informalization. The PSUs are being dismantled. They are talking about sabka saath, sabka vikas. Kiska saath, kiska vikas? All those Gujarati people who are running away with the bank money to some European countries, unka vikas, kiska vikas ho raha hai? We are seeing increasing unemployment, जिसका impact शायद इस बार election में देखने को मिल जाए, शायद मिल जाए इस बार कम से कम. लेकिन they are smart enough to tamper the EVM machines also. So now, yes.
Conclude in 1 minute.
Yes.
Sorry.
So ILO also has delivered an historic commitment in the 100th anniversary conference in 2019, which was agreed between the unions, employers, and governments to a human-centered future of work with a realization of social contract embodied in the mandate of the ILO 100 years ago. Now, the declaration is an agenda for the rights and protection of all workers at a time when the world faces the enormous challenges of climate change and digital transformation, and for a labor protection floor for all workers. The labor protection floor includes the hundreds of millions of workers who are trapped in this informal economy, whose jobs are insecure, dangerous, and are not being paid enough to even support their family and their livelihood. Forget about after the work. Thank you so much. Sorry if I have taken time. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sister Shehnaz, for a very kind of opening so many the avenues of discussion. I think there will be a lot of questions for you also, but let me just take a last presentation, and I have already requested my colleague Chinmay to sort of consolidate all the questions. So yes, Shehnaz ji, boliye.
I would like to add that on behalf of INTUC, we would definitely like to give our solidarity on the universal social protection, and we would like to definitely go with it. And I would request you to kindly meet our Honorable President, Dr. G. Sanjeeva Reddy ji, when he next visits here. And I will see that we have that meeting and we talk about it. And I'm sure all central trade unions will come with open arms to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Sister Shehnaz, for the words of solidarity and also the beyond words of solidarity. Thank you so much. So quickly going to our last speaker, Rakshita Swami. Rakshita is associated with the People's Action on Employment Guarantee. She's also co-founded SUFFER, which is SUFFER is basically an organization which works on the social accountability. And Rakshita has been on the forefront of consolidating movement on the questions of urban MNREGA. So Rakshita, floor is yours. Thank you.
Shukriya, Chandan. I think समय के बचाव के लिए, एंड ऑल्सो मेरा मुद्दा भी ऐसा है कि आई थिंक सबसे कम बोलने को है क्योंकि दूसरे सेक्टर्स में पहले कुछ था जो कम हो गया है, या इट्स आई मीन देयर समथिंग सब्सटेंशियल टू टॉक अबाउट, बट यहाँ पे इट्स ऑलमोस्ट जस्ट अ कंसोलिडेशन ऑफ आवर डिमांड्स। तो शुरुआत में आई जस्ट स्टार्टिंग विद द अर्बन राइट टू वर्क, ये हमने देखा था कि ड्यूरिंग द पैंडेमिक it was not like the advocacy and demand for an urban right to work is something that is new. बहुत यहाँ पे बहुत कॉलीग्स है, बहुत साथीज है, कैंपेन्स है, नेटवर्क्स है जो बहुत सालों से एक्चुअली एक अर्बन राइट टू वर्क के एडवोकेसी में सेंट्रली इन्वॉल्व थे, एंड इनफैक्ट इवन NREGA was, I mean, it was the advocacy began with the right to work, of which only the NREGA got legislated and came into being. But we felt that during the pandemic and the 2 subsequent years of lockdown, the plight of migrant workers, unorganized workers, I mean, the fact that it actually came into mainstream consciousness, and you could see visuals and people and classes who were very disconnected from unorganized workers for the first time actually realized कि ये इसका एक पूरा एक ऐसा class है, community है, और उनकी गतिविधियां कितनी परेशानी से चल रही है। तो एक अर्बन एम्प्लॉयमेंट गारंटी का बहुत चर्चा शुरू हो गया था इन द प्रेस। देयर आर स्टिल लॉट्स ऑफ ओपिनियन पीसेस बीइंग रिटन ऑन इट, बहुत पेपर्स भी सर्कुलेट हो रहे थे, और पीपल्स एक्शन फॉर एम्प्लॉयमेंट गारंटी also initiated a series of consultations to understand कि इस ग्रुप्स के बीच में कोई असहमति नहीं है कि शहरी रोजगार की गारंटी होनी चाहिए, बट इसकी रूपरेखा कैसे होगी उसी पे चर्चा करने की जरूरत है। इम्प्लीमेंटिंग एजेंसी कौन होगा, मशीन्स का क्या रोल होगा, कॉन्ट्रैक्टर्स का क्या रोल होगा, वेज रेट किस लेवल पे फिक्स किया जाना चाहिए, worker rights, how do you ensure कि those without domicile certificates have a right to an urban employment। इन सब में बहुत चर्चा हुई और इससे बारीकी से इस मुद्दे को समझा गया, पढ़ा गया, और इसके ऊपर विचार बाहर निकल के आया। And there was some fleeting noises also made from Government of India, Ministry of Labour, whether it was Ministry of Labour, whether it was advisors of Government of India coming out in support of something like an urban employment guarantee. But we realized, cut to the budget of 2022-23, there was absolutely no mention of the urban employment guarantee. And it is disturbing foremost because it is an indication of the central government falsely assuming that the crisis of the pandemic is over, that the kind of a crisis that migrant workers and unorganized workers faced during lockdown was something that was purely episodic, और अब क्योंकि कोविड हट गया, लॉकडाउन्स हट गए, अभी कोई शहरी रोजगार गारंटी की करने की बात की कोई जरूरत नहीं रही, वो सेंस ऑफ अर्जेंसी नहीं है, ये दर्शा रहा है the fact that it at all had no mention. Yet again, the silver lining in this is where the central government is not showing the path or the way forward. We have seen that state governments have risen to the occasion and have shown what are possibilities. तो हिमाचल प्रदेश, उड़ीसा, केरला, तमिलनाडु, झारखंड, ये इन 5 राज्यों ने अपनी ही शहरी रोजगार गारंटी के स्कीम्स इंट्रोड्यूस करे हैं without waiting for any central mandate to come from the central government. But whereas ये एक शुरुआत जरूर है, एक स्कीम तो निकली, एक nominal, I mean it's not just nominal allocations, but it's far below what can really make a difference. On an average, about 80 to 100 crores have been allocated in these state budgets for these schemes. But इसमें भी इसका जो रूपरेखा है शहरी गारंटी स्कीम्स का इन राज्यों में, हमने देखा है कि काफी लिमिटेड है. इट इज स्टिल सीन एज अ PWD, पब्लिक वर्क्स प्लस स्कीम, बट द इमेजिनेशन ऑफ एक्चुअली trying to help urban commons, trying to revive an economy at an urban area cannot be seen in many of the scheme guidelines that have come out. And most importantly, none of these schemes have an element of guarantee. In these 5 states, you have urban employment schemes, but there is no liability on the state government for not providing work for those who demand it. Like the MNREGA, there is no guarantee element in any of these schemes. And isme zarur ye hai, something that Shaw himself has pointed out and written about very often, ki even in our advocacy, we are not absolutely clear कि एक अर्बन रोजगार का ढांचा कैसे होगा. With NREGA, we had an advantage that we had seen famine works, we had seen the Maharashtra EGS, so we knew what to specifically demand for and see in a rural employment guarantee. But in an urban, it's very clear that we cannot transpose a NREGA and just put it into an urban area. There has to be a lot of learning that will have to come from doing, and hopefully in these 5 schemes in the states, though there are limitations, we should at least try and see this in our own states. WPC के नेटवर्क से, बाकी यूनियंस के नेटवर्क से हम समझे कि धरातल में ये स्कीम्स कैसे चल रहे हैं और इसको इम्प्रूव कैसे किया जा सकता है. Third point is, I think even going forward, because our advocacy for an urban employment guarantee just cannot, will not waver. But there are 2 particular things that we can see that even though it does not require a great financial liability on the part of whether the central government or the state government, still governments are not stepping up and doing this. Just say, if, for example, in an urban employment guarantee, we have consistently been saying that it is not just about providing work on public works for urban, I wouldn't use the word residents, but people living in urban areas. The imagination has to be much wider. So because people don't come to urban areas just because government is going to give work whenever there's a need. People come, they're self-employed, they are employed in precarious conditions. So whether it's street vendors, hamals, auto drivers, waste pickers, sanitation workers, dhobis, अगर आप ई-श्रम का पूरा लिस्ट निकाल दे, at least that is what it can be held to worth as. उसमें कैसे, how can an urban employment guarantee provide an imagination of protecting the work of self-employed and those already employed but under other precarious conditions? How can an urban employment guarantee look at providing guarantees of protection against displacement, गारंटी कि आप किसी को किसी जगह से उठा के कहीं और नहीं डाल सकते, अगर डालते हैं तो उनका रिहैबिलिटेशन कॉम्पेंसेशन क्या होगा, इन सभी को, इन सारे काइंड्स ऑफ पीपल हु आर सेल्फ एम्प्लॉयड, इनको कैसे एक मिनिमम सोशल सिक्योरिटी आर्किटेक्चर के साथ जोड़ा जा सकता है, perhaps through a board like Maharashtra has also shown us the way. So I think this is definitely an issue that we all need to look at a little bit more closely. And is also something that even in the advocacy of an urban right to work, we need to include centrally within our advocacy. The last point that I wanted to flag is, again, just an indication of where the intent or the lack of intent of the government also lies is, even for instance, you see the class of gig platform workers. हम देख रहे हैं कि एक emerging class of workers है, and जहाँ पे actually governments को खुद अपना ही meaning, where governments don't even have to invest public money, where their own budget is not being compromised, but actually under the motor vehicles aggregators guidelines, they can impose a cess on an aggregator and introduce welfare schemes. वही नहीं कर पा रहे हैं. किसी भी राज्य में उन्होंने कोई ऐसा वेलफेयर स्कीम इंट्रोड्यूस नहीं कराया है और अपनी ही गाइडलाइंस को फॉलो नहीं करा है, is also an indication of just the lack of sensitivity that the union government, or largely the union government, has towards the plight of urban workers, particularly unorganized workers. तो इसी में मैं बस अपनी बात रखना चाहती थी, and we'll open it to questions that I'm sure many people have for many panelists.
Thank you so much, Rakshita, for very very pointing out the whole key questions what we have been discussing about urban MNREGA and a lot of other. सिर्फ बजट पे बात नहीं कि उन्होंने एक बड़े पॉलिटिकल सवाल को भी उठाया, आई थिंक उसको भी एड्रेस करना बहुत जरूरी है. मैं क्वेश्चंस लेने से पहले हमारे बीच में एक दो साथी हैं, काफी सीनियर साथी हैं, प्रोफेसर रवि श्रीवास्तव एंड प्रोफेसर बाबू मैथ्यू. Both have really helped us in the last 4-5 years to develop the demands of social security, also linking to the whole budget question. Ravi sir, do you want to say something? If you are Ravi sir. Yeah.
नहीं, थैंक यू फॉर इनवाइटिंग मी टू स्पीक. मैं बहुत ज्यादा कुछ नहीं कहना चाहता हूँ. मैं कहता हूँ, मैं समझता हूँ कि जॉन ने जो बजट की और जिस तरह से एक्चुअली हम देखें तो एक थोड़ा सा एक दौर था जिसमें सोशल लेजिस्लेशंस या बल्कि कई एंटाइटलमेंट क्रिएटिंग लेजिस्लेशंस ही नहीं बढ़ रहे थे 2004-5 से लेके 2013 के बीच में, बल्कि उस बीच जो व्यय भी था, जो सार्वजनिक व्यय किया जा रहा था सामाजिक सुरक्षा पर जीडीपी के परसेंटेज के रूप में या रेवेन्यू के परसेंटेज के रूप में, वो बढ़ रहा था। लेकिन 2014-15 के बाद से अगर आप देखें तो निरंतर इसमें गिरावट होती जा रही है। और मतलब ये जो 2021 का प्रकरण था, जो एक संकट का समय था, उसको अगर आप थोड़े समय के लिए अगर बगल कर दें तो निरंतर सामाजिक सुरक्षा पर जो खर्चे किए जा रहे हैं उनमें गिरावट हुई है। और एंटाइटलमेंट बेस या राइट्स बेस सोशल प्रोटेक्शन को नजरअंदाज किया जा रहा है। तो ये बात प्रोफेसर कानन ने कही, बहुत सारे और साथियों ने कही, एक्चुअली वी नीड टू basically talk about a universal social protection, minimum level of social protection, and I think it was very important कि आपने इस WPC के माध्यम से बजट के संदर्भ में इस बात को रखी, क्योंकि ये तो हम देख ही सकते हैं कि खर्च निरंतर कम होते जा रहे हैं, लेकिन ये भी देखने की बात है कि अगर हम कुछ एक न्यूनतम स्तर पर या किसी भी स्तर पर अगर हम यूनिवर्सल सोशल प्रोटेक्शन की बात करें तो वो फाइनेंशियली हम कितना दबाव सरकार पर डाल सकते हैं उतना व्यय करने के लिए। और एक साल का हम उसको एक परिप्रेक्ष्य न ले, 5 साल 10 साल का परिप्रेक्ष्य ले, और हम ये कम से कम मान के चलें कि बहुत आज सरकार 25 साल के परिप्रेक्ष्य में बजट की बात कर रही है, तो हम कम से कम 10 साल के परिप्रेक्ष्य में या 5 साल के परिप्रेक्ष्य में एक न्यूनतम या एक सोशल प्रोटेक्शन की बात, यूनिवर्सल सोशल प्रोटेक्शन की हम बात कर सकते हैं, और इसको हमें रखना चाहिए। और खासतौर से ये कई लोगों ने कहा कि इस अवधि में, मतलब पैंडेमिक से उभरता हुआ जो अनौपचारिक क्षेत्र है, अनौपचारिक क्षेत्र का मजदूर है, उसके ऊपर इतना कुठाराघात हुआ है डिमोनेटाइजेशन से लेके, एक्चुअली 2016 से लेके 2022 तक निरंतर वैसे ही कोई ऐसी उसकी जिंदगी दूबर रहती है, लेकिन इन 6 वर्षों में इतना ज्यादा कुठाराघात हुआ है कि अब हमको बहुत गंभीरता से जो मौलिक प्रश्न है, न्यूनतम मजदूरी का भी एक प्रश्न है, जैसा कि प्रोफेसर कानन ने बात की, इनको खड़ा करना पड़ेगा और इनको राजनीतिक रूप से खड़ा करना पड़ेगा। ये एक बात तय है कि जब तक ये प्रश्न एक राजनीतिक प्रश्न नहीं बनते, और ये हमने फार्मर्स एजिटेशन में देखा, अगर फार्म लॉज का रोल बैक हुआ तो सिर्फ इसलिए हुआ क्योंकि ये एक राजनीतिक प्रश्न बन गया था, सरकार के लिए राजनीतिक प्रश्न बन गया था। तो सिर्फ इसको एक आर्थिक प्रश्न के रूप में अगर हम देखते रहेंगे, जैसा कि गलतियां हमारी ट्रेड यूनियंस बहुत सारे दशकों से करती रही हैं, तो इसका समाधान हम नहीं कर पाएंगे। हमें सरकारों को अकाउंटेबल बनाना पड़ेगा और इसके एक राजनीतिक तौर पर हमें सरकारों के सामने इसको रखना पड़ेगा, राज्य सरकारों के सामने और केंद्र सरकारों के सामने। मैं बस इतना ही कहना चाहता हूँ। थैंक यू
सो मच रवि सर। ये बिल्कुल सही सवाल है कि जब तक राजनीतिक सवाल नहीं बनेंगे सोशल सिक्योरिटी, लेकिन आपका जो पूरा एक इन्वॉल्वमेंट रहा हम सब लोग के साथ में पिछले 5-6 वर्षों में, हम लोगों ने बहुत समझा है, बहुत सीखा है कि कैसे डिमांड्स को फ्रेम करना है। हमें बहुत पिछले 2-3 सालों में तो बहुत सारी हमारे आइडियाज में भी, सोचने में भी क्लैरिटी आई है कि कितना पैसा चाहिए, क्या चाहिए। तो मुझे लगता है कि इन सवालों को आगे लेके जाना एक बड़ा चैलेंज है। और इफ प्रोफेसर बाबू मैथ्यू इज देयर, आई वुड लाइक टू ऑल्सो request him to speak maybe 2 minutes, if he can speak especially what the framework you have given us, sir, about extending ESIC and EPFO by removing threshold, and particularly that this has been, and you actually showcase this, that how these two laws are sort of complying on the ILO Convention 102. So maybe if you can speak few words about that, sir, then we can open the floor, sir. Yeah.
Thank you, Chandan, and thank you, Working People's Charter, for bringing this valuable group together. I just want to mention that, I work with my colleagues on the legal dimensions, the legal aspect of it. And I just want to say at this stage that the Indian legal framework enables us to come up with any kind of legal formulation that will deliver, provided there is the resources for it. I think today's session has largely concentrated on the resource dimension, and what would otherwise appear utopian has now appeared to be something which is doable, of course, provided there is the political will. But the political economy possibilities have been well pointed out. So that's my takeaway from today's session. I don't think this is appropriate for me to go into the details of the legal provisions, except to say that when we have a framework about which there is unanimity in terms of doability, then a framework certainly can be worked out. The last thing I want to say is that the plethora of laws that existed in India, those plethora of laws need to be analyzed very systematically in order to come out with what will provide the base level of social protection and the base level of wages. And of course, how do you make sure that freedom of association becomes a tangible right? So I won't say more than that at this stage. I thank Working People's Charter, and I think there's a tremendous jump forward. We need to still make it a little more precise in terms of numbers, and I hope WCPC will go on to that. And at an appropriate stage, we will be ready to back that up with the legal dimension. So it's an extremely useful interdisciplinary experience. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Matthew, for considering our request to make a quick intervention, and also grateful to Ravi sir, as he has been one of our very key thought leader and mentor in sort of shaping our demand. So thank you both of you for coming it up and speaking. I think we have still 8 to 9 minutes. We can just open the. I'll ask maybe Chinmay, if you can hear me. Maybe if you have consolidated any sort of a specific question which you can read it out.
Yes.
Opening floor will take a lot of time and people will speak, but if you can just read it on the questions, and any panel speakers can pick it up and respond. Yeah.
Yes. So I will start with the first question that Kathani has raised, and this is just this question was for Amit, and Amit had answered it to that also. But for everyone, I would just read it out. Government is laying a lot of stress on high-end infrastructure of expressways, airports, etc. But how productive are these investments? Are there studies which show that the returns on such investment or are these the investment that are resulting in NPAs? In contrast, it is proven that $1 invested in a child gives a return of $7. So for that, Amit has answered. This is a very important question to address. One question is, what are their multipliers, which you have raised? The other is, who do these projects primarily benefits? And one recent study by IDFC Institute shows that the local level infrastructure is much more important for MSMEs than these large and high-end infrastructures of expressways and airports. The second question, which is open to all the speakers, can social security benefits, especially pensions, be universalized without contributions from the currently working population who can contribute towards social security and contributions from the government? Most developed countries have pay-as-you-go system for financing pensions.
Thanks, Chinmay, for consolidating all the questions. I mean,
there are three more questions, but should I read it out or just open the floor for this question?
No, just read it out, Chinmay. I think it would, because we are running a very short of time. We have 6 to 7 minutes. Please.
Okay. So second question is, what is the possible policy response to plug the 2-year gap in secondary and higher education in rural India? How can we ensure that these children don't lose out to so much that they have a permanent disadvantage in an already shrinking employment market? This is a question by Sriram VG to John, but I think he had to leave the meeting, so I would open it up to all the speakers. Second question is by Anusha. Labor codes has introduced floor wages, which can be set only by the central government, causing unhealthy competition for low wages. What is the way out of this? And third is again, you have made a very interesting point that the regime's cruel treatment of the migrant workers during the sudden lockdown and after lifting it is overlaying the Hindutva attitude vis-a-vis caste hierarchy in India. This is a comment especially for Joe. And would you like to elaborate on that? So I think that was dedicated to Joe. That's it. These are the comments that are in the chat box. Yeah.
Some comments and some questions I think John had to leave, but we have Amitabh Guha, Shahnaz. We also have some speakers had to leave because of some emergency, but some speakers are there. Rakshita is here, Shahnaz is here. So please, I'll request whoever the speakers is basically still there, maybe you can respond on this question, especially about the universal social protection, what Professor Srivastava and Professor Matthew also raised it on that. Professor Guha, if you, Comrade Guha, do you want to start with a quick comment? Comrade Guha, you have to unmute.
Yeah. You need my comment.
Yes.
Chandan?
Yes.
Comment on what? Give me specific.
The question is about the possibility of the universal social protection, which is raised a couple of times, and especially the social security, which is sort of won by the one section of workers in the last 70 years. How we can extend it to the entire informal workforce. That's the whole debate is basically coming it up from the chat rooms. Yeah.
Social protection is universally functioning.
Yeah.
And ILO's target is to put it in different countries. But in our country, we are moving away from the social protection measures. Even whatever meager it had been existing earlier, we are shifting away from that. So therefore, the reason is most importantly now is to see that whatever we had achieved, this achievement has come because of the struggle by the workers, struggle by the parliamentarians. Because of that, couple of laws favoring the workers have come, couple of decisions have come in favoring the workers. These have been systematically taken away. Therefore, India is going in the reverse direction from the social protection system as envisaged by the ILO's Universal Declaration. Therefore, it is most important for us to restore, first, to restore what we had. And then we should go beyond it, that how new things can be covered in the social protection. For example, the labor codes, they say, the government said that they will have separate legislation, separate benefits for unorganized workers. For example, gig workers, they said they will do something, but nothing's have been done. So even in the name of so-called that Shram portal, benefit what could be achieved by available by the unorganized workers had not been released by the labor minister. Despite 3 months before, he assured us that there will be a specific declaration from them that what kind of benefits they will go get. This, they said that we have identified 90 different provisions. So these professions which are not getting any social protection, how this social protection, what are the quantum and various degrees and titles of the social protection would be given has not been declared by the labor ministry. So precisely what I wanted to say, the government's move is to squeeze more the social protection available at the moment. And therefore, all the labor codes we have demanded should be repealed. We have demanded that the ESIs and provident funds should be expanded for universalization. Now they say that we will extend it for the scheme workers. For example, the Asha, Anganwadi, but for them they said that 25% contribution has to be given for them in the ESIs, whereas 1.28% is for the other workers. What a fun is this? So they are playing with the workers, they are playing with their own words, and they are squeezing the opportunities so far available. So it has to be repealed.
Thank you, Amitabh. We are just, Shahnaz, if you're there, then please just make a small inputs. Shahnaz, you're there? Okay. Rakshita, do you want to say something as a last, like closing comments? Okay. So we have to close it because of the time. We are extending with the time. Just to say that we'll come back with the report of whatever people have said, the demands. I just wanted to make a small clarification about the demands which Amitavada was reading in the beginning. It was basically a calculation we did in 2017 by using the framework of Unorganized Workers Social Security Act 2008. This is not the demand we are saying. We just said that even to meet that demand, which if you use as a mechanism of 2008 Act, you need a 2.3% of the country's GDP. And we calculated, we went through a very detailed context about that, why we are saying 55 years for the men, why we are saying 50 years for women, why we are saying 6 months, the unemployment allowance for the women workers. So we had a long discussion, like 2 years of discussion, then we came up with a calculation. But presently, our demand is very clear, which we also now taking it forward as a political demand to the larger movement space. We are saying that we need ESIC and EPFO for all the workers, as Professor Matthew said, that these two laws basically comply to all the indicators of ILO Social Security Convention 102. And we are also adding the question of old age pension and the urban MNREGA. So these 4 demands, we are taking it forward, and we want to basically include these 4 questions as a kind of what we call the social security floor and whatever you call it, but as a kind of the basic social security demand on behalf of WPC. So thank you so much. Just wanted to clarify this, and we'll come back to all of you with this whole consolidation of these inputs. Thank you so much. Thank you. We can close it, Chinmay.